What is up, you guys? Welcome back to another True Crime Sunday. If you are new here, feel free to click the subscribe button. We do true crime videos every Sunday and sometimes an extra video during the week. So today is going to be a long one. I'm not sure if it's going to be in 2 parts or even 3 parts. It is an ongoing trial. The person hasn't been sentenced yet. They're at the rear end of the trial and I feel like it's pretty complete at this point. The only thing that we don't know yet is what the verdict is. To me, I'm pretty sure I know what the verdict is going to be, whether I agree with it or not. The only other thing from that is what the sentence is going to be. Now, this is a death penalty case. I don't know where you guys stand on on if you think that it's okay to kill people or not, like if they've been convicted of something, but this is a death penalty case, and this is the case of Tim Jones Jr. I say junior, usually I wouldn't think that's important, but what we're going to talk about involves Tim Jones Sr. So just for the sake of this video, we're talking about Tim Jones Jr. He grew up with, basically he was raised by his grandparents and his father, because his mother Cynthia is a schizophrenic, and so she is a schizophrenic to the point where she is institutionalized. Throughout this trial has literally gone for, well, I've been watching this trial all day, every day for the last 2 weeks, because this trial, thankfully for me, in terms of me gathering all the correct information, has been live streamed on YouTube. Unfortunately, they don't edit out all of the breaks that they take, because it is literally just a camera set up by the court and it just live streams all day, every day of the trial. So there's a lot of hours there where they're not talking, or they're just, you know, it's been a very lengthy, boring process, but then it has also been really valuable for me because I basically get to sit there as if I'm part of the jury. So thank God for technology. So I'm just going to start off by telling you a succinct version, the version that I learnt before the trial, and little pieces from the trial. But as we get on further into the video, there will be added pieces from different experts and different witnesses that were called to testify. So we're going to start off with the relationship between Amber Kaiser and Tim Jones Jr. So they met when they were 19 years old, and they met in a place called the Enchanted Castle. And I think this is like similar to Chuck E. Cheese or something like that. It's like a kid's thing. But anyway, they worked there together and that's how they met. Tim Jones Jr., and we'll get into what happened to make him this way, but he was very religious. He was Pentecostal. So you know those people who read the Bible and they're like, yes, this must be taken literally. I'm not just talking about the people who are like, no to the gays or whatever. I'm talking about the people who literally live by things like not wearing mixed fabrics and things like that. Like, he took scripture, he took it literally. He went to this really small Pentecostal church. When the pastor testified, and we'll talk about that later, when the pastor testified, he said that Tim had a way of annoying people within the church because he was so literal with scripture. So anyway, when Tim and Amber met, they were 19, they had dated for 6 weeks, and after 6 weeks, they got married. They got married in this church, and it was because of the temptation of being in a long-term relationship and the temptation of doing things when you're not married. So he married Amber after 6 weeks, and it was very soon. Now, Amber was impressed with Tim. Tim was this smart guy. He was in college at this time. He had a part-time job. He really had his life together. Amber thought he was really, really smart, and she didn't even have her high school diploma. And so yeah, she thought this guy has his life together, and I guess she didn't see any issue marrying after 6 weeks of dating. She would also be kind of okay with some of the things that he, like some of his rules, but she wasn't allowed to cut her hair. She had to wear dresses at a certain length. Girls were not allowed to wear pants. You weren't allowed to wear jewelry, and basically he believed in like women must be modest, women must be seen and not heard, and that's something that he was quoted as saying. So Amber did like live her life like this as well, and so then they moved to Mississippi. He's studying to be an engineer. They had 3 kids by this point. So the 3 kids that they had by this point was Mira, Elias, and Natan. After Tim graduated from his degree, they then moved to Lexington County, and later Tim would get his first job with the corporation Intel, and I'm sure all of us know what Intel is, and I'm sure if you don't know, you have to be really smart to be an engineer. And Tim actually graduated at the top of his class. And I didn't know what summa cum laude, or was it summa cum laude means, but basically if you graduate at that level, that is the highest level. It is like prestigious. It means that you basically a genius if you graduate cum laude. I don't know what that was. At this point, Amber was pregnant. She assumed when they got their job that things were on the up, because Intel is, you know, he's got a very stable job at this point. But Tim did something very strange. He bought a trailer, and this wasn't a nice trailer. It wasn't, in terms of the money he was earning and in terms of where their life was at, this was just a very strange move for the family, especially because by this point they've got 4 kids, you know, and this trailer was really, it was disgusting, really, if we're being honest. And there was just so much clutter, and it was just not a good environment. So instead of buying a house, he went ahead and bought a rundown trailer. And at this point, this is where Amber changed, like, not just like all of a sudden I changed my mind because we're living in a trailer, but this is where she kind of fell off a little bit. And you know, they had been married for quite some time, and they married quite young. They have 4 children, and they're living in a trailer, a disgusting trailer. And also Tim at this point started to get stricter and stricter, not just with the kids but with Amber. Amber's job was to look after the kids, look after the trailer, and make sure the kids were out of Tim's way. And I don't know why, but he was quoted as saying that he wanted a farm full of kids. I think that's where religion comes in. I think he wanted that because of the religion thing, and I think, you know, I don't read the Bible. I'm not religious myself, so I don't know where religion stands in terms of having children, but I don't know. It just seems like they're related to me. Amber described being with Tim at this point as just always walking on eggshells. She said that she even told Tim's father that, hey, Tim needs professional help. And she said it didn't take, well, you didn't take anything to make Tim mad. He could turn around and just be very angry with you for no reason. The trailer and the anger and the expectations on her, paired with the strict morals, even though she also was, you know, religious and going to the church as well, a combination of these things were what made Amber be like, I don't want this anymore. Even though he did punish the children, she said the abuse was directed at her, and at this point Tim was just PTing the kids as punishment, so making them do squats, push-ups, standing on their tippy toes, things like that. Amber says that she was having an affair, and obviously Tim had his suspicions about this prior to finding out, but he did find out she was having an affair. She moved to a neighbor's house because the person she was having an affair with was a neighbor, and so she moved in with that. So Sean Kaiser is who she was having an affair with. They're now married, they now have a child, but at that point in time when she was still with Tim, she was having an affair with Sean. So she separated from Tim. They weren't legally divorced yet, but she moved in with her now husband's mother. So it was, I don't know, a little trailer park, neighborhood trailer park thing. They did later go on to have a divorce, and as I'm sure you've already gathered by now, Tim is really, really smart. He has this job at Intel. He has a place to live. He has a vehicle. Whereas Amber doesn't have her high school diploma. She doesn't have any money. She doesn't have a job. And she doesn't have a vehicle. And yeah, she obviously isn't going to have money for an attorney. Whereas Tim an engineer who works for Intel, even though he lives in a trailer, that was just a decision he made. It wasn't because he needed to live in a trailer. He chose to live in a trailer. So he has money for an attorney, to which he hires an attorney, and as I'm sure you can tell, the judge ruled in Tim's favor. So Tim got full custody of all of the children, and also she was pregnant at this time, and so she had another baby, and he would then get that baby as well. Amber said that she was not willing to give up her parental rights. So she did organize to have supervised visitation, and Tim was the supervisor at the time, but she also had regular phone calls with the children. She would call every single night at 7 p.m. And this is where we get into the thick of the events of why we're here talking about it today. So one night at 7 p.m, Amber makes her usual phone call to the kids. Tim would let her call on Tim's phone, and he would put it on speakerphone, and on this particular night she heard her son Nathan crying and gasping for air, and she's like, what's going on, like what's wrong? And she also heard Tim yelling at Nathan in the background, and so she's like, what's going on? And she just hears Tim yelling at Nathan saying, you could have killed yourself, or something like that. And then Nathan is wheezing, gasping for air, crying and saying, Mum, I didn't mean to do it. And she's like, what is going on? And just to calm her son, she's like, it's okay, you're okay. And then at this point, Tim is like, you always take the kid's side. And then he said, what did he say? I think he said, shut the F up, or he just swore at her, and then he hung up. And she was like, what the heck? And so at this point, she tried calling back several times and he just wouldn't answer. So after she called him several times to no avail, she left some voice messages, which we would later hear. In the trial, when we heard the voicemails, she was heard saying, I don't know what is going on with you right now. Something is going on. All I said was, it's okay, to Nathan. So can you please call back? You're being very erratic and all this stuff. And so that was basically the consensus of that voicemail. The next time that Amber would talk to Tim would be after the Labor Day weekend. And little did she know at this point, all of her children were already dead. So after the Labor Day weekend, she would call Tim several times because she couldn't get a hold of him, so she just kept calling him. And then the time that he did answer, she was like, how am I supposed to have my calls with the children if you're not going to answer? And his excuse for that was, I've just been traveling around a lot, I've been moving around a lot. And she was like, you sound intoxicated. She would describe him on that phone call later on to say he kind of sounded like he was carefree. We have the recording for this phone call, and it was played at trial, and this was because Amber knew something was wrong. So she had downloaded an app previous to this, and it was an app where you can record certain people's phone calls. So if she ever made a phone call to Tim, or if Tim ever made a phone call to her, the app would know to start recording that phone call. Because Amber did have a scheduled visit to meet, or at least to see her kids at Chick-fil-A a couple of days after that, she decided to still show up, even though she wasn't quite sure if Tim would show up. And she did have some law enforcement there waiting, but he just never showed up. So what actually happened? You will hear a couple of different versions of these, some more detailed than the last, but as I said, this trial is still going on, so I'm just going to give you a very succinct version because I will be repeating myself later. But basically what had happened was Nathan had blown some electrical outlets in the trailer the night that all the kids were murdered. Tim would say that he was PTing Nathan, and he said that he didn't think there was anything wrong with that. And he was trying to get Nathan to tell him what he had done to the outlets and why. And apparently he wasn't getting anything out of Nathan, and he was PTing him, making him do squats, push-ups, and he said that this was something that they usually did. And he said that Nathan would later pass away from this. He said that he didn't see any lead up to him dying. He said that it could have possibly been maybe he got an electric shock and it took away some electrolytes or something like that, and when he PT'd him too hard, Natan possibly died from that. The way that Tim describes Natan being dead, he describes it as saying Natan is deceased. And you could chalk this down to him being removed from the situation. You could chalk it down to him being just an engineer type person who is maybe also a little bit crazy. Or you could chalk it down to, or you could just say a lot of things, but it's just very strange the way that he describes Natan, his son, being dead because he PT'd him too hard. But anyway, this whole thing is going to get very, very confusing. You're going to be like, I don't understand this man's logic. You will change your mind. You will change your mind throughout this video and throughout the trials a lot. But if you don't think that that makes sense, after he realized that his son Natan had died, he then went and killed all of his other children. So Natan did die of obviously exertion, and at this point he said that he just freaked out and he didn't kill the kids straight away. When I first heard of the story was told to me, or at least I read it from sources, as if Natan had died because he had PT'd him too hard, and that he then went and killed the other children. When in reality, Natan died. Tim then went to the store to get like a 10-pack of cigarettes. He also brought some of his kids with him when he went to the store, and then he went back to the house to YouTube that American History X scene where they're in the jail and it's a rape scene. And so when he comes back from the store, his child was already dead. He then YouTubes this rape scene, and then he goes on to strangle all of his other children. And it wasn't a snap decision like that. Like, he had time to process it. He had time to YouTube a thing. He had time to go to the store. He even had time between killing each other child. Because apparently Mira said something while he was strangling her. And then apparently another one of his children said, I want to go with daddy, while his dad was murdering him. So we'll get into what his justifications are for that later, but I just wanted to give you a rundown of what actually happened. So after that, he put the children in the boot of his car and he drove around for 9 days. 9 days before he got caught. So that is just the briefest version of this story, but I did want to just give you guys a heads up on what I'm talking about, because the majority of this video is going to be about the trials, and the majority of the video is going to be whether or not he, because this is a death penalty case, whether or not he can save himself from the death penalty by having an insanity plea, because that is what he has pleaded. He's pleaded not guilty by reasons of insanity. And my mind has changed on this so many times, because there have been so many different experts, so many different witness statements, and so much different evidence. So that is what these videos are going to be today. So you already know the murder. You already know that Tim, I will say, he has confessed to this. We are not debating whether or not he killed his children, because he has confessed, yes, I killed my children. We are debating whether or not he is insane or not. You will change your mind about this. If our minds are anything alike, you will change your mind a couple of times. I will say that regardless of whatever you hear about Amber Kaiser, which is their mother, because you will hear different witness testimonies saying that Amber didn't care about the kids, or Amber was just a bad mom. I know that not everyone is 100% good and 100% bad. I will say that every time I have watched Amber on the witness stand has been incredibly hard for me, and I have cried while watching her cry. So regardless of whether she had an affair, regardless of whether she neglected the children, regardless of all that kind of stuff, you can tell she is destroyed by this, and you can tell that she did love her children. She just maybe wasn't the best mom, if you know what I'm saying. She did write her children some letters that she read out on the witness stand, because she felt like she had ruined their home, and she felt like her leaving Tim was the reason. And you know, she read out those letters and she just broke down and she started wailing. The court had to be out of session by that point. She was screaming, she was crying. It was horrific, and I cried. I had to stop watching at that point, because seeing someone, I usually don't react when I see someone else cry, but when you see someone wailing in pain, I just can't even. I've never seen anything like it. I will also say that something you will hear about often in this trial is Scooby snacks or spice. And basically what Scooby snacks and spice are is synthetic marijuana. And marijuana, I don't know why I said that real weird, but basically it's synthetic marijuana. And it is legal in some places and it is illegal in other places. Tim, while he was driving these dead bodies of his children in his car, was constantly on spice. And that will be brought up a lot in this trial. So the confession tapes, you guys have access to this. I will link it down below. At first, I was like, this guy is faking being crazy, because it's very hard. It's very, very hard to be like, he is crazy, he is not crazy. That's what this whole thing is about. That is why it has gone for so long. You will hear him, like you can't see him because they didn't surveillance footage it, and they were having trouble with the voice recording. They had to record it a second time. Well, not a second time, just the introduction. They realized it wasn't recording. So I guess when they were reading him his rights and all that kind of stuff, that wasn't recorded. But in the confession tape recording, you can hear his demeanor change, like a snap second. Like when he talks about the kids, he will be crying. And then I remember in another point where he was like, he was telling the investigator in what order he killed the kids, and he was kind of like, he sounded like he was crying. But then he made a mistake and he was like, oh no, actually I did another child first. And when he said that, he wasn't crying. He sounded very matter of fact. And then when he continued to talk about it, that's when he started crying again. So he was like, his demeanor changed when he was talking about different things. And I remember during the tapes, and this did come up in when the investigators came up on the witness stand, they did say this, and I noticed it as well on the tapes. But basically another pivotal point where his demeanor changed was when he was like crying and being hysterical, and then all of a sudden like that he said, all right guys, let's cut to the chase. And it was just weird. Another thing you'll hear him say in this particular interview is that the reason he took spice all the time was because it calmed the voices. Now this is going to be something that comes up in this trial a lot, like literally with every single witness expert that they have on the stand, is whether or not the voices that Tim is describing in this interview are his own thoughts and he's calling them voices, or if they are schizophrenic voices, because the defense, Tim's defense, is saying that he is insane because he has basically schizophrenia and bipolar disorder mixed together, but the main thing is schizophrenia. So the prosecution in every witness that they have is saying the voices he's talking about are his own nervous energy, his own thoughts, because we all have our own voice in our head. We all do. That's what thinking is our own thoughts. And the way Tim talks about it, even though he says they are voices in his head, the way he's describing those voices are as if you're describing the voice in your head that every single person has. When I first came across this case, even though it did take him 9 days to get caught, and he wasn't doing a very great job at hiding, I will say. However, even though he was driving around for 9 days, at first glance it seems like he came forward pretty easily, until you realize that this confession that he did, this was after he had lied so many times to a different investigator. And he only told the truth to these investigators because he liked them and he could talk to them pretty easily, and I think he already knew that the jig was up. So just bear in mind that even though it does seem like he came forward pretty easily, he had lied about a lot of things until he realized the jig was up. So after he had driven around a couple of days with the corpses in his car, he did go to a Walmart and he bought a saw to cut up the bodies, and he also bought muriatic acid to dissolve the bodies. And he also had a note in his car which had lists of different things he was going to do with the bodies, and he did try and cut Natan's leg off. He didn't try it with the other children, and when he was asked why he started with Natan, or at least tried to cut Natan's leg off, because he kept saying, I couldn't do it, I tried and I was going to, I had planned to, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. He says that he couldn't bring himself to do it because, you know, oh, like I couldn't bring myself to do it. But then you could also say, well, maybe because he did try and he did start, maybe he wasn't physically strong enough to get past the bone. But anyway, he couldn't actually cut off Natan's leg. And so when he was asked why Natan, Tim said that, well, because he's the reason that all of this happened in the first place. If he had just told me what he was doing with the electrical outlets, none of this would have happened. And the police were like, so if he had just told you what happened, you wouldn't have murdered all the other kids? And he was like, yeah. He said the reason he went to Natan to cut off his leg is because Natan was the focal point of this whole entire thing. On this note, it did have things that said like sand down the bones and just like a whole bunch of like dispose of it in like a landfill thing. So he had lots of different things that he was planning to do with the corpses. And it also had another section where the header was loose ends, and it had like the babysitter, the kids' school, things like that. So there was a lot of planning. Even if it is after the murders, that's planning. You're planning on what to do with these corpses. You're planning on how to save your own ass during this. And he did say that the voices that he was hearing after Natan had died, previous to him killing the rest of the children, that the voices were saying, Tim, you're fucked. Tim, they're gonna catch you. Things like, and something interesting that on this list that he wrote where he was like sand down the bones, dissolve the bodies in acid, you'd put a smiley face after that. Now with the blood in the car, because there was a lot of blood in the car, when he was asked about this, he was like, well, I think there was blood in the car because, you know, when you like have bodies in there for so, because it was 9 days, like that's a long time. And I'm not going to get into the details of what happens to a decomposing body, but most of the decomposing happens within the first 24 hours. They were in there for 9 days. And he was basically saying, I was just getting like air fresheners to try and get rid of the smell. And he described it like it smelled like shit. And so he would park next to dumpsters to try and make people think that the smell was the dumpsters, because he was sleeping in his car. And so when the police found it and they found the blood, he first said, oh, that's just animal blood. And then when they were like, this is human blood, he was like, it's just a cut. It was a cut. I had a cut. And then I remember when I was watching his dad on the witness stand, because when he first got caught, the police called Timothy Jones Sr. to come and help them, because at first he wasn't saying anything and he was just lying and he was just being a little shit. And so his dad was called up and he drove all the way there, and his dad, when he was on the witness stand describing the process of everything that happened, he said that the police officer got out of the car and was like, this is a substantial amount of blood. Now, what the hell did you do to these kids? And that's when his dad knew that his son had actually done something to the kids. In this confession tape, the police were basically like, what were you thinking about these 9 days that you had these corpses in the back of your car? And Tim was just like, I was just trying to buy time. Like in this confession tape, he was like, I was just trying to buy time. I knew I was already effed. I don't know why I'm saying effed when I've already sworn in this video, and it's probably not ever gonna have the chance to be monetized anyway because I'm talking about death and murder. But anyway, he was basically like, I just was buying time, I was fucked. I knew I was gonna get caught, and yeah, at one point he was gonna go to Vegas. He withdrew like $500 and he's like, I knew I was gonna get caught, I'm gonna just, you know, buy my time and stuff like that. And when the police were like, did you ever consider suicide? He was like, never. He was like, I would never do that to myself. Like, the investigator, when he was describing the confession, was like, he described it as being a very Timothy focused dilemma instead of a like, my children are dead. He was thinking about himself, and the investigators described him as having, it was like he was expelling nervous energy instead of being devastated that his children are dead. So in this trial, you have you've got literally so many different experts come in, and they are all esteemed experts. Person who deals with brains, he's like a doctor, that guy came in. We also had a therapist that Tim had seen prior to the murders. She was like a marriage counselor. And then we had another psychologist come in from the defense's side. We had a psychologist come in from the prosecution side, and then we also had a psychologist come in who was court appointed, because you had to have experts from not just the defense, not just the prosecution, because they're both arguing he's guilty or he's not guilty. You also have to have someone from the court, because the court is meant to be a these are the facts kind of thing. So they also had one hired by the court who was very objective and wasn't being paid to be one side or the other. So one expert from the defense's side came in and said that Tim has mild brain damage and he also has schizophrenia. Now, let's talk about the mild brain damage, because I'm gonna describe Tim as being, okay, so if you've seen The Office, you know what Dwight looks like. That is what Tim looks like. Tim looks like a disheveled Dwight. Now, he hasn't always looked like this. He looks very, bear in mind, Tim has been in prison for, I think, 4 years now. So he's lost his hair. He used to have hair prior. I'll show you. This is what he looked like when he was arrested, and this is what he looked like in trial. Like, two different people. He's gained a lot of weight. He lost all his hair. He looks different. He looks very, very different. But what I can tell you is, it might not have been obvious when he had hair, but now that he doesn't have hair, he's got this huge dent in his head. He had a car accident when he was 15, and a huge part of this trial is them saying, well, at least the defense saying, this caused him brain damage, which either made his schizophrenia worse or is a reason why he is not responsible for this. And when I first heard that he had mild brain damage, I was like, whatever, like, you guys are just, you're just trying to think of a defense. But when you actually look at his head, you can tell, like, he's got like it's just very misshapen. His whole head is just a weird shape. Like, I'm not making fun of him. He just, like, I'm looking at it right now. Like, you can tell his head is not symmetrical. And, you know, I don't know, there's people who have weird shaped heads. So, I mean, without second glance, I mean, without knowing that that part of his brain is like indented, you would just think he has a weird shaped head. But basically, the neuroscientist person came in and showed us what a normal brain is supposed to look like, and then he showed us a 3D version of Tim's brain on the computer. Sis, it is like, okay, so that's your brain, that it's meant to be symmetrical. So the left side of his brain is like, that bit's missing. Well, it's like concaved. So it's not symmetrical because he had a brain injury. And this is the part of the brain where your emotions and your capacity to make good decisions is impacted. And he also noted that schizophrenia it's not just thoughts that go wrong. It's not just like just a mental thing. He said that it is very much a physical brain thing. Like, it affects your brain physically, and if you don't get medication for it, it will affect your brain physically, because it's not just bad thoughts, you know what I'm saying? Schizophrenics operate on a spectrum. So you've got schizophrenics who will walk down the street with a trolley cart wearing 5 different coats, and it's the middle of summer and they're talking to themselves. So that is a form of a schizophrenic. And then you've got schizophrenics who wins the Nobel Prize. He said that there are very smart schizophrenics. This particular expert said that he has reviewed footage of Cynthia, which is Tim's mum, who has schizophrenia. And he said, look, she definitely looks like someone who has been treated for years. Now, Tim's mum has been institutionalized for 20 years, I believe. And how he was treated as a baby does affect how he is now. And that is the defense basically saying that this is what made him crazy and this is why he's not guilty. So we have all these different people testifying on Tim's behalf. And you have to remember, and this is something that I had to remind myself of, is that even though they are testifying things that will ultimately help a not guilty plea, they are telling the truth, I believe, because they loved these children and they also cried when they had to talk about the children. So that is something that I had to remind myself of. I was like, there's no way that, because I was very much like these guys, like, just put him in jail right now. And, you know, I just had to remind myself that this is the children's grandparents. This is the children's great-grandparents as well. And just because they are also Tim's parents or Tim's grandparents, it doesn't mean that they're not telling the truth. So they described how Tim was treated as a baby. Cynthia, her schizophrenic tendencies got worse when she got pregnant. And apparently she just did not even look at the baby. She didn't want to pick up the baby. And when when Tim would cry, she would just say, shut the F up. And when Tim's dad, Tim Jones Sr., would come home from work, he would find her in the closet cutting up her clothes. And he thought she just feels fat and she's just cutting up her clothes because she's upset. He didn't chalk it down to schizophrenia because they didn't know. And it got worse, and she would leave for days and not come back. Sometimes she would take Tim with her and other times she wouldn't. One time she tried to kidnap Tim. She would bathe him in cold water. She would put him in layers and layers during summer, and people would be like, it's really hot. And she wouldn't feed him because she said she didn't want a fat baby. And so this is how Tim grew up. And I think when Tim was 2 years old, his mum Cynthia was institutionalized for the first time. And this was when I think she was only there for a weekend, and then she got out, and that's when she tried to kidnap Tim, who was only 2 at this time. She crawled through a window because at the time they were living with Tim Jones Sr.'s mother. They called the police. Cynthia was arrested, and then she was institutionalized again. And so Tim grew up knowing that his mum was sick, but he didn't know the extent of it. So he always was just like, I want my mum. And as much as his grandmother was like, look, your mother is sick, she is not capable of looking after you, he always felt they were keeping him from his mum. And so he always grew up with mummy issues, which he would later go on to continuously bring up about his life and how he was feeling in things. This particular expert tried to say that Tim has a really low IQ, and this is something that the prosecution, in cross-examining this expert, was like, you say that Tim has a really low IQ, but he graduated summa cum laude and he's an engineer who works for Intel. And while he's doing all of these things intellectually, he's also managing to have a part-time job while he was studying. He had a family and he was married. And then when he went to work for Intel after he graduated, he was still married and still had 5 children. The prosecution brought in their expert, and their expert was like to the jury, no, Tim does not have a very low IQ. The reason Tim showed to have a very low IQ is because they have Tim on schizophrenic medication that he should not be on. And the side effects of this medication, especially if you are not schizophrenic, is that it makes you docile, it makes you really slow in the head, and that is why Tim is testing at such a low IQ. Tim does not have a low IQ. It is because of this schizophrenic medication that they now have him on that is making him seem demented. Religion is a huge part of this story. So when Tim was growing up, he was kind of a loner. His grandmother described him as being a loner, but it didn't really matter because for things like birthdays and like, I don't know, like as in Tim's birthday, because they had such a huge family, there were just already so many kids around. So he didn't really need to bring school friends to the house or anything like that. They had a huge family and they loved Tim. So he was very loved, even though he had a mother who was not the best mother. That happened when he was under 2 years old. So even though he always wanted for his mother, and that will affect you, if especially during those crucial moments of when a baby needs their mother, and it does affect the development of the brain. Just in terms of me, like myself, like my mother was very much like Tim's mother. My mum would never pick me up, and like there's stories of when I was a kid where I would literally scream and cry for my mum, but she just would go to her naughty place, which is what she called the bathroom, when she was doing her drugs. And I would stand at the bathroom door and I would scream for her, and she would not come and pick me up. And that's why I've got a lot of needs that aren't being met. And my needs are a little bit higher than your average person's needs. And I do things that are like considered, like in the psychological world, as self-soothing. And that's what babies do when they don't get their thing. So I understand this all too well, so that I definitely relate to this. I mean, I'm not murdering my children, and I hope that I never do if I ever have children. This is a big reason as to why I don't know if I will have children, but I understand. I relate, and I'm telling you right now, this is a real thing. So Tim has grown up, even though he has a family who loves him, he doesn't have a mother, and he was neglected in those crucial moments of development. And so he keeps growing up having mummy issues, which really affect his behavior. Even though he's grown up super, super smart, he would later get into some trouble. And even though he was never diagnosed with schizophrenia or anything up until after the murders, he tried to join the Navy, which was just a really weird thing for everyone. They were like, how are you going to join the Navy? And he told everyone that he did not get accepted into the Navy, or at least into the Air Forces, because he had a bad ear. When on the Navy's files, he was rejected because he had mental health problems. So it's all now coming out that that's why he was rejected from the Army or the Navy or whatever it was. And but at the time, he told his family that he was rejected because he had a bad ear or something like that. But yeah, as I was saying before, religion is a huge thing. So after he got rejected from the Army, he started behaving really badly, stealing cars, doing drugs. And he actually got caught because he was not a very good criminal, and so he went to jail. And he was in jail for about a year. His father always said that he raised his son to the best of his ability. And he always raised all of his children to be like, if you do something wrong, you need to do the time. And on the witness stand here, Tim Jones Sr. was like, we loved him, but he did a stupid thing and he needed to do his time. And we said, when you're done, call us and we'll come pick you up, but you need to do your time. And so he did his time. And like a lot of people find in jail, they either find drugs or religion, and Tim Jr. found religion. But you have to keep in mind that Tim's brain is not all there. He is looking for something. He needs something. And so religion, I'm looking at a picture of Tim crying right now. It's just like, that's what's on my screen. I don't know why. But anyway, he needed something, and religion was that thing. And it just so happened that he took a hold of religion and he never really let it go. So the next witness to come up on the witness stand was someone I think was just a clerk in one of his attorney's things. And he was just basically reading off their inventory that they had taken from the house, and it was literally just so much religious stuff that it's crazy. You know how children usually have like kids books and things like that? Apparently there are like religion versions of kids books, like with scripture and stuff like that, and it was a lot of religious stuff. Like, I'm talking boxes of religious books for the children. Like, they weren't allowed to have normal books. And in some of these books, in some of the pages, the kids had written notes being like they want to live with their mum, and they, you know, all this stuff. And it's really sad looking back on, like, hindsight is a beautiful thing. Just in case you guys are wondering right now, where was social services? We'll get into that soon, sis. But first we're going to learn about the pastor, because Tim's pastor actually testified. So we know that Tim is Pentecostal, and at this point it was like a church of 5 people. It was like a church that was just like getting off the ground, and the pastor testified saying that Tim was always super smart. However, he took scripture to be real life. He described Tim as being the only person in church who could annoy everyone by the end of church, because he would judge the other church members. The pastor said that he took scripture so seriously, and he has a brilliant mind to where he can recite scripture perfectly. And he said that one of the reasons why Tim left the church in the first place is because even though he could recite scripture from his memory perfectly, he couldn't actually help people with it, because Tim was like, he needed control in his life. He really wanted to have like an authoritative role within the church, but the pastor would not let him have that, because the pastor said, you can be really great in remembering script, but if you can't help people with that script and help them relate that to their life in a meaningful, positive way, then you're no good to the church. If you're just going to recite script to people and judge them because they're not taking scripture literally. And this pastor described him as taking scripture way too literally. So the pastor was not letting Tim have any sort of leadership role within the church, and Tim really, really wanted that. Another thing that set Tim away from the church is that Tim sat the pastor down one day and tried to tell the pastor that not in anything that she said, not in anything that she did, but in the way that she dressed and the way her expressions were, that the pastor's wife was trying to seduce Tim. Not from anything she said, not from anything she did, but from the way her face looked and from the way that she dressed. So the pastor was like, what? The pastor on the witness stand was like, this has been my wife for decades, and let me tell you, she is an introvert. She doesn't really do a lot. The way that the pastor described his wife was that he was like, we went to a Starbucks and she went in to go and collect the coffee, and one of our church members worked in the Starbucks, and she just in her own mind that she didn't even realize that the person who goes to our church worked at the Starbucks and served her. And so the way the pastor was just like, no, like that's just not in her character. I knew right when Tim tried to tell me that was just the funniest thing I'd ever heard, and it was a bit loopy. So that was the pastor's testimony on Tim. So even Tim's pastor was like, Tim was a religious nut, and that's coming from a pastor. So I keep saying pastor as in like pastor, but you guys know I mean pastor. Like pastor, not pastor. Before the pastor got off the stand, because the pastor I think testified for the defense, because the defense is trying to say, look, even the pastor says that Tim's crazy. So before the pastor left the witness stand, the prosecution stood up and said, just one thing I just want to ask. Did Tim understand the fundamentals of the Bible and of scripture? And the pastor was like, yes, like to a T. And then the prosecution was like, okay, just one more thing. Did Tim understand the basic fundamental rule of the Bible, thou shalt not kill? And the pastor was like, 100%. And I was just like, burn! You know what I'm saying? Like, prosecution, that was smart. And I'm like, that was a straight up burn, you know? No one? I thought that was like a courthouse burn. So the next person that the defense would call is the marriage counselor. So basically, even though Tim was like super like suspicious and things like that, we know now that his suspicions had basis, but he was a very paranoid man. So he decided to go to marriage counseling, and the marriage counselor did extend an invitation to Amber, but at this time, I think the trailer they were living in was just very far away from the therapist's office. And so Amber couldn't actually come to their marriage counseling, and Tim claims that he asked Amber if she would do a conference call. I don't know if she said no or yes. She could have said no. This could have been in the time where she was like, I definitely don't want to be in this relationship, and she just hadn't left yet because of her kids. But yes, Amber never went to marriage counseling. Tim was the only person who went to marriage counseling. This could have been because she didn't want to go, or this could have been because Tim didn't make it very accessible for her. Could be either way, doesn't really matter. But anyway, Tim was going to see a marriage counselor, and this was funded through his work at Intel. So it was either heavily subsidized or Intel were paying for his therapy. This marriage counselor did say that Tim was very religious. After one of their sessions, after their first session, she stood up to say goodbye to Tim. If you've ever seen a therapist, they all do this. It's just a polite thing. So she stood up and she was wearing high heels, and Tim turned around and requested that the next time she see him, she should not wear high heels so that she wouldn't be taller than him. And then I think the defense was like, low-key, did you wear high heels the next session? And she was like, my patients don't determine what I wear. Of course I wore high heels the next session. And the therapist did note that Tim has feelings of inferiority. He was paranoid, and he has pretty severe mother issues. And that he also has problems with like arguing with other people, and he just was an angry man. She said pretty much the same stuff as the last medical professional had said, except this time she described a time when Tim actually met his mother, and it kind of scarred him a little bit, and I'm sure that it did. He said that when he met his mother, Cynthia, that she was swatting at things that weren't there, and she was talking to someone who wasn't there, and that scarred him, like it would anyone. That is not a very pleasant thing to see. And this is where Tim started talking about the monster in their sessions. And she says, so when she's describing their sessions and she's on the witness stand, she does say that she believed at the time, and she still does believe, that the monster is just Tim. She says that she doesn't think that this is a schizophrenic monster. She says that the way that Tim described the monster is literally just him describing his bad thoughts, not a different entity. Not that he believes there is a different entity inside him. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like when you are being dramatic and you might describe your dramatic side to you as being a drama queen. You know, that's the way he was describing his bad habits, as being a monster. It's not in the way of, that was Patricia, if you know what I'm saying. That's not the way he was describing the monster. She said he described the monster in a way of, that's just like a bad version of me, not as in the monster is Patricia. So don't think that is, you know, the defense is trying to make it seem like he's talking about the monster in that way, but this medical professional says that's not how I interpreted his talking about the monster. So Tim describes the monster throughout all of his sessions as being the angry version of himself, basically. And the monster would come out in times when there was a deficit of information. So if he thinks that Amber's not telling him the truth, that's when the monster comes out. And Amber describes not being able to be around him when the monster comes out, which I'm sure no one wants to be around someone when they're angry. When the therapist asked Tim in one of these sessions, what is your biggest and worst fear. Tim's words were, my worst fear is that Amber is going to get a job and she's going to move on. That was his biggest fear. So Tim's biggest problems are family related, and the narrative that the defense is giving is that his fear is that his children are gonna end up without a mother, basically, and that he's gonna end up feeling rejected, and all of this stems back to his childhood, which it does. But that is not the question. And I feel like a lot of the testimony is revolving around this, when I think the biggest question and the thing that they need to prove to us is whether or not Tim knew legal and moral wrong from right at the time that he murdered his children. But I guess they're trying to build up to this. But so far at this point in the trial, they were just kind of going around in circles, and I'm like, I've heard all of this stuff before, and I just want you to tell me what the thing is. But it's not that simple. This marriage counselor at the time actually provided a letter for his custody battle. And an important thing to note here, and this is something that the prosecution is arguing, is that all of these medical professionals are basing their opinion on what Tim is giving them. So this marriage counselor didn't know that he had been in jail before. This marriage counselor didn't know that he had had trouble with drugs before. And this marriage counselor didn't know that child safety were on his trail. And so she was acting on information that she got straight from Tim. So because this marriage counselor was acting on only what Tim had told her, that is why she wrote a letter to the courts saying, Tim is a great father. Tim is really smart. Tim has a great job. Tim has a good income. He should have custody. And I'm sure if she knew stuff that Tim wasn't telling her, then I'm sure that she would not have written that note for Tim. Kim did display some worrying behavior in front of this marriage counselor, because this marriage counselor testified that Tim was not happy with how Amber was homeschooling these kids. And let me just say, if you want your wife to homeschool your kids, shouldn't she have like a high school diploma? If she doesn't have a high school diploma, how is she gonna homeschool your kids good? But anyway, Tim was just not happy with the level of education that the kids had. He was not happy with how she was homeschooling the kids, and his word to this marriage counselor was that he wanted to strangle Amber. And for me, just now, I just like, I don't know, maybe it is one of those things where she just took it as like a offhand comment or something like that. And you know, obviously at that point, the kids were not dead. And at this point now, the kids are dead. And I'm like, he just said he wants to strangle, you know, hindsight is a beautiful thing. So maybe she just took it as an offhand comment, but he did say he wanted to strangle Amber because the level of education that the kids had was not up to par. And remember, Tim is a very, very smart guy, and he's just very analytical, and he has expectations for his children that he wants them to reach. And at one point, he said that he was really disappointed because one child in particular, Mira, wasn't reaching the expectations that he had had. And the therapist described Tim as being disappointed in having to lower his expectations for Mira, because he said that she just probably wasn't gonna get there. She was taking things just a lot slower than the other kids. So he described spanking his kids and corporate punishment as being medicine for their bodies. I don't know, maybe she's just not, you know, I don't know, it kind of sounds religious, but then also I'm just like, I don't know if the Bible says that, hun. Like maybe she just thought he was being religious. But to me, saying that spanking and corporal punishment is medicine for a child's body is just like weird to me. That would be a red flag. Apparently it wasn't to her. But again, remember, the defense is using her to say that he is crazy. So maybe he was crazy, I don't know. But we'll get into that soon. Did he know right from wrong? Now, it is no question that the kids wanted to live with their mother. And it is no question that this is a trigger for him, because in times when he would let Amber see the kids would cry if they had to leave her. And it was just described as by almost every single witness that was put on the stand that Tim was heavily triggered by the kids wanting to live with Amber and not him. And as I'm sure you've already connected by now, Tim needs these connections. Tim needs to feel needed by his children. Tim needs to feel needed by his wife. And it's kind of rejection after rejection. His wife didn't want him. His mother didn't want him. His children want to be with their mother. And he sees that as just another blow to his self-esteem. So I can relate to that. But I don't, you know, obviously to a certain extent, I relate to that. This marriage counselor asked Tim's permission to let the kids come and see a therapist, not her in particular, just a different therapist who worked in the same building. And Tim was like, yeah, actually that's a good idea. And he said, I'm really worried about having to talk to Mira and have the talk with Mira, because I don't know, Mira was a very young girl before she died, but I think maybe he didn't understand when girls get their period, and some girls get them younger. He was just very scared to have that conversation with Mira, because that's typically something that he thinks the mother should do. And so he was very welcoming in having those kids get some therapy. And the kids actually did go to a couple of sessions. And it's not like the kids hated their dad. The kids loved their dad. And the kids, you know, it was just that the kids also loved their mother. And it was just that the kids cried when the mother left, and it's just that the kids cried when they had to leave her visitation. And the kids, you know, it's just that it doesn't mean that the kids did not love their father, even though their father was very strict and did some bad things before the actual murders. And the mother also did some bad things. The kids loved both of them. It's just that the fact that the kids also loved their mother was a huge trigger for Tim. Now, because this marriage counselor is a witness for the defense, the prosecution then cross-examined this marriage counselor, and the prosecution were like, you left out a part in your notes when you were telling the jury that Amber hadn't seen her kids in 4 months. And so that's when they started talking about the notes, the information that the marriage counselor left out to the jury. So the prosecution were like, so in your notes, you describe Tim as having a plan to get custody for the children. And in your notes, you were saying that his plan was to deny Amber's right to see the children so that it would extend past 6 months. Because if it extended past 6 months, they could say in their custody hearing that Amber hadn't seen the kids in 6 months, which would ultimately revoke all of Amber's parental right. And the marriage counselor was like, yes, that's true. And so, you know, it's like if you're a witness for the defense, you're only going to hear certain things. And that is why it's important for both the defense and the prosecution to have the same information, so that the prosecution can then cross-examine and be like, well, you said this for the defense, but can you tell us the whole story? And so had there not been any cross-examining, I would have just thought that Amber was just straight up a bad mum. You know, she has done some bad things, which we will learn about soon, but it's not like Amber didn't want to see her children. It's that Amber lived 7-hour drive away from where Tim had taken the children, and Tim also, you know, she would show up and then he just wouldn't bring the kids. So then he could say that it's been past 6 months that she hasn't seen the kids. So there is two sides to every story, and we will learn that later on in the trial. This is when the prosecution, during cross-examining this marriage counselor, asked her what her qualifications are. And she told all of her qualifications, which were very impressive. And that's when the prosecution was like, okay, cool. So you are qualified to make a diagnosis. And she was like, yes. And they were like, so if Tim was a schizophrenic, if Tim is a schizophrenic, why did you not diagnose him? And then that's when she, even though she is a witness for the defense, she then had to tell the truth, you know, and be like, well, I didn't see any signs of schizophrenia, and if I did, I would have sent him to a specialist. So that's kind of something where you can be like, okay, well, this therapist who saw Tim prior to the murders is saying that Tim wasn't showing any signs of schizophrenia. This entire trial is based on Tim saying that he has schizophrenia. So that is one little notch in the prosecution's belt. The prosecution asked this marriage counselor if Tim had ever had any delusions or hallucinations, to which she said no, Tim didn't have any. And this is when the prosecution asked the marriage counselor to explain the key symptoms of schizophrenia, to which the marriage counselor told the jury what the key symptoms are. And then the prosecution said, did Tim show any signs of schizophrenia? To which the marriage counselor said, no, he did not. And if he did, I would have sent him to a specialist to be medicated. The prosecution then asked the marriage counselor if prior to the murders in their sessions, if Tim ever just had a flat demeanor, if in times where his situation was dire, was very low, if he was flat during that, and if in times where things were really good for Tim, if he was just flat during that, because that's one of the symptoms of schizophrenia. And she was like, no, he was able to feel happy and he was able to feel very sad. By her saying that, she is further, you know, because then the prosecution says, okay, well then what are some symptoms of someone who is not schizophrenic, who is taking medication for schizophrenia? And the marriage counselor then said a flat demeanor. And so that further bolsters the prosecution's claims that Tim is only acting like he has schizophrenia now because he is on medication for schizophrenia, which will make you seem, it'll basically make you seem docile, like you're sedated. So he does have the capacity to feel highs and lows, and it was always appropriate to the situation. The prosecution asked her if it was possible for Tim to have hidden the signs of schizophrenia from her, and she was like, it's possible, but unlikely. And then the prosecution ended their cross-examination by saying, well, is it possible for Tim to be faking signs of schizophrenia? To which he said yes. So far, we have heard people on the defense's side. I have one more witness to tell you about, and that is still from the defense's side. I'm going to be doing this video in 2 different videos. So I'm going to be talking about all of the defense's medical experts, and then in the next video I'm going to talk about what happened with child safety prior to the murders, and then I'm going to talk about the evidence on the prosecution side, and then a little bit more from the defense's side. So this video will be in 2 videos. So this doctor said that the brain isn't fully developed until you're 25 years old, but because it was pretty well developed by the time he had his car accident, the parts of his brain where things like intelligence and things like that are developed and pretty well established wouldn't be hindered by this point. Like, it could be affected, but because it is already developed, it isn't being restricted from developing further. So the defense is trying to say that this brain damage doesn't affect his intelligence, it only affects his emotions and his ability to make good decisions. This I'm gonna link this particular doctor's testimony below because it's very interesting, and I learned a lot about my own mental health and how my brain has formed and things like that. I think everyone should watch it, even if it is in a murder trial. It was just very, very interesting, and he explained it in a very fun way. He brought his own brain molds and things like that. It's just very interesting. But basically, the prosecution cross-examined him prior to him leaving the stand because this was a witness which was paid for by the defense. So when the prosecution came up, they were like, are you aware that the court has appointed someone to have a look at Tim's brain and also test him on things, and this court appointed professional has found no signs of schizophrenia? And this particular medical professional said, I am aware of that. They disagree. And the prosecution said, okay, so if you have 2 identical brains and they show basically the same scan, they have brain damage and they have schizophrenia, well, they've got a history of schizophrenia in their family. They said, from these scans, can you tell me which one of these people are going to end up murdering their family? And the doctor was like, well, no. And the prosecution was like, okay, so just by looking at Tim's brain scans, you can tell that there's possibility for brain damage, and he has a history of schizophrenia in his family. So if you can't tell me that just by looking at someone's brain, whether or not they are going to be murdering their family, then how can you say that this is the reason why he murdered his family? The prosecution, in cross-examining this particular expert, said, okay, so basically the only people who are saying that Tim has schizophrenia are people who are hired on Tim's side. And they were basically like, they asked if he can say whether Tim knew right from wrong at the time of murdering his children. And this particular medical professional said, I can't testify to that. The only thing I can tell you is that Tim's brain is broken. So basically, that expert couldn't tell us whether or not Tim knew right from wrong. That expert couldn't tell us whether or not he has schizophrenia, because you can't look at someone's brain and see schizophrenia in a brain. And he can't say whether or not Tim had schizophrenic like moments during the murders. He can't tell us whether or not Tim knows moral or legal right from wrong. He's basically just there to tell the jury that Tim had a car accident when he was 15, and it possibly had an effect on his emotional thinking. And the prosecution did bring up that even though this expert is saying that this can affect the decisions that you make, they bring up the fact that Tim has never had an issue after the car accident. Tim has never had an issue having a marriage, having a family, graduating summa cum laude, top of his class. Then he never had an issue working for Intel, that he did all of these things that someone with that kind of brain injury shouldn't be able to do because they can't make good decisions. So the prosecution were basically like, all right, cool expert, man, but that doesn't apply to Tim, because after the car accident, we should have seen some change in the way he excelled, to which we didn't, because he excelled quite a bit and he was able to do things that people without brain injuries struggle to do, in terms of having a family, having a good job, all this stuff. And so while that medical professional's testimony was really interesting to me and did sway me to be on Tim's side a little bit, when I was reminded that that doesn't really apply to Tim in this case, while it was very, very interesting, it doesn't really help Tim's case. And I kind of feel like if they didn't redirect my attentions to that, I kind of would have been swayed. But I will be swayed again. And I'm sure you will too, because in the next video, because I can't put this all in one video, it would take a week to upload and a week for you to watch. Not a week for you to watch, but this is going to have to be split up into a couple of videos. So next week's True Crime Sunday will be part 2 of the Timothy Jones Jr. case, and I am sorry that I couldn't do it all in one, but it is just such a huge case, and it is a case that is developing as we speak. It hasn't been sentenced yet, so thus far, all we've gone through is what happened and the defense's experts and a little bit of background on what is happening here in the Timothy Jones Jr. case. So next week, we're going to talk about the prosecution's witnesses, the court-appointed witnesses, the family, and then we're also going to hear a lot of testimony from all the things that were happening prior, like literally weeks before the kids' murders, and in terms of child safety and in terms of the different babysitters that he had who have testified, and one of the babysitters who was his girlfriend. So I will see you in next week's True Crime Sunday. It'll be part 2 of this case. Thank you so much for watching. Please give it a thumbs up. It really does help, and leave a comment down below. Do you think so far from just hearing the defense's experts, do you think that he is guilty of this? Obviously he's guilty of this, but by reason of insanity. And another question, let me know down in the comments below, do you believe in capital punishment? Do you believe that murderers and things like that should be put to death by the hands of us? Or do you think they should be locked up forever and ever? So yeah, let me know in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe. I will put my head here. I know I said that wrong. I'll put my head here if you want to subscribe, and I will see you in part 2 next week on Sunday.